So good morning and welcome back. Different venue, different day, similar faces, but a more important task. Yesterday for the last 3 days, we were engaged on discussions on what we want the world to be. Today we have an opportunity to work together to make it exactly the world it should be. G20 is a forum that has some capabilities of shaping the global agenda. It has the ability to make the big economies respond to the challenges of our times. It must also make each of them more responsible to those who are not part of that grouping. Rather than speak for them, they should listen to them and hear them and be responsive and partner with them. This town hall is an attempt to hear people. Hear people from, of course, the G20 countries, but also from those who are not part of that group. The Indian Prime Minister, a few weeks ago, hosted 125 global leaders to listen to them prior to engaging with his partners in the G20 countries, so that the Indian priorities could be shaped by the global expectations, global aspirations, global concerns, global vulnerabilities. Today, the idea is to structure it in a manner in which we have some trigger presentations. We would have them on themes as specific as climate and energy, on digital futures, on questions of gender, and of course on the SDG agenda, which has taken a severe beating courtesy the pandemic and the war in Europe. I'm delighted to welcome all of you this morning to share your perspectives with us at the T20. And I have Mr. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy who's here, and he will be speaking to us in a bit. And of course, with the Sherpa, who's here this morning with us, who is steering the G20 agenda, work, outreach, convenings, as well as perhaps also the direction for the future as the presidency moves from India to Brazil and then to South Africa. I just want to also give you a sense of where you are. This is a location from the 1930s, designed by the same architect who built the Connaught Place in New Delhi. This is the former residence of the first Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. It was converted into a museum and thereafter a library by subsequent governments, and most recently Prime Minister Modi and his government have built a Prime Minister's Museum here, which has glimpses of the lives of all our Prime Ministers since independence. So this is a historical venue, but this is also a library and a museum and a place where India and Indian thinkers, Indian organizations meet, discuss, debate, and deliberate on very important issues. So we thought this would be a good location for a town hall where we discuss some of the matters which are of concern to all of us. Let me invite Mr. Amitabh Kant on stage and Ambassador Sujan Chinoy on stage to join us this morning. And I will be requesting both of them to speak to us. Mr. Amitabh Kant, the Sherpa of the G20, and of course someone who has told the Indian story, sold the Indian story, and written the Indian story as a very long practicing bureaucrat, head of a planning organization, and now as the G20 Sherpa. Ambassador Sujan Chinoy is the chair of the T20. He's also the DG of IDSA, one of the old MP IDSA, one of the oldest and most prolific think tanks in India. And I have the pleasure of inviting both of them on stage. Ambassador Chinoy, please join us on stage. And Mr. Amitabh Kant, can you also join us on stage, sir? We have just some housekeeping announcements. What we have done here is that we have some seats reserved for those who will be speaking from the hall, and I think we have identified 40 speakers through the day who will be presenting on various themes. And we have 5 cameras, so even though you will be speaking from where you are, you will be visible to all of us in the room. And we will have the trigger presentations from the podium to kick off the proceedings before we turn to you. You do not have to pose questions to the speaker. In fact, you have to give suggestions to all of us to take forward. So we want your ideas, and we want your solutions, and we want your perspectives on what we should be doing. And the trigger presentation would be just to contextualize a aspect of that particular issue, not necessarily comprehensive or directional, but just a trigger for debate and discussions. But your voices and your presentations through the day would be the most important outcome from this particular gathering. Now with that, let me invite the Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, to speak to us this morning. Mr. Kant, can I turn the mic to you?
My very distinguished colleague and chairman of the T20, Mr. Sujan Chinoy, Samir, who's the master conductor, who's done such a great job of organizing the Raisina dialogue in which I participated for the last 2 days. So my heartiest congratulations on a very successful and one of the most outstanding global conferences. And my distinguished colleague, Mr. Ashish Sinha, who works with me in the G20 Secretariat, all the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly delighted to be speaking to all of you who've come from different parts of the world. And today's objective is for me to just give you a broad overview of these challenging times and India's priorities of G20, and then listen to your perspective and listen to your ideas and benefit from your canvas, so that we can include some of your worldview into India's G20 presidency and take it forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, the world is passing through very complex, extremely challenging and turbulent times. We're in the midst of a more than a 1-year-long war in Europe. This has led to very severe complications on food, fuel, fertilizer. The post-COVID era has seen almost 200 million people going below the poverty line and almost 100 million people losing their jobs. This has never happened before. And we are midway through the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. And instead of progressing, the world has regressed in terms of learning outcomes, in terms of health outcomes, in terms of nutritional standard for the children. And therefore, the lives of a vast number of citizens across the world have been impacted. We are also in the midst of a global slowdown, and almost 1/3 of the world is in recession, and almost 75 countries of the world are facing a global debt crisis. So multiple crises, from debt to slowdown to geopolitics, a year-long war with no solution in sight, and the impact on livelihoods of citizens because of the COVID. And in the midst of all this, India is hosting the G20 presidency. We see all these challenges, but we view them as opportunities. And I think every challenge in the world is an opportunity, and therefore, how best do we use this opportunity to bring global consensus through G20. G20 is important because it accounts for almost 85% of the global GDP. It accounts for almost 78% of the global trade. It accounts for 90% of the global patents. It accounts for 2/3 of the world's population. But more important than that, it's important because the United Nations, which was structured in the post-World War II era, has become dysfunctional. We'd never envisaged a scenario that the Security Council, which comprised of 5 leading powers, one of which will go to a war, or a year-long war, and therefore the very basic principle of veto will outlive its utility, and therefore its ability, United Nations' ability to drive decision-making, to take the world forward, has been totally lost. It's become an unwieldy body. And therefore, in the past, if you look back from 2002 onwards, whenever there has been a crisis, whether it was a slowdown of economies, whether it was the impact on the liquidity of the banks or the debt crisis, it's G20 which has acted and acted fast. 2002 in London, later in Hamburg, much later in Saudi, G20 has acted and acted strongly. And therefore our view is that this is a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to accelerate the pace of inclusive, resilient, sustainable growth. And without growth, let me assure you, there will be no progress on SDG, there will be no progress in climate action, and therefore long-term, inclusive, resilient, sustainable growth, which takes care of the global south, is a key priority. There's also the challenge that the world has not been able to live up to its commitment on climate action. And therefore, the earth may survive, but as human beings, we'll all become extinct. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us that at 1.5 degree centigrade, we are able to take the world forward in a sustainable manner. Out of the 2,800 gigatons of carbon space available at 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2,400 gigatons has already been occupied, 2/3 of it by the developed world. And that because the developed world was industrializing, and therefore in the name of climate justice in 2009, it was envisaged by the developed world that they would provide $100 billion a year up to 2020. And later in Paris, this period was extended to 2025. The developed world has not lived up to its commitment. But irrespective of countries, let me tell you that there is vast amount of capital available. There's no shortage of funds. The vast amount of funds available with institutional lenders across the world. But this would require us to de-risk projects, this would require us to de-risk regions, and this would require new instruments of credit enhancements, first loss guarantees, blended finance, and this would require us to reshape the multilateral institutions which were designed for a post-World War II Bretton Woods period. And these institutions have outlived their utility, and therefore they need to become institutions of climate finance, and they need to become institutions of sustainable development goals. And instead of doing direct lending, they should be doing a lot of what is known as credit enhancements through the institution of MEGA, which is an existing institution of the World Bank. And therefore, in the context of today's challenge, there is a need for bold, pragmatic, and progressive measures and decision making. There's also the challenge that how do you improve the impact of COVID on the vast segment of the population in global south? How do you improve their learning outcomes? How do you improve their health outcomes? How do you improve their quality of life Because after all, when leaders meet on September 9th and 10th in Delhi, the leaders have to take care of the citizens of the world. And therefore, our view has been that this will not happen without digital transformation. And digital transformation will not have an impact without digital public infrastructure of tomorrow. In India, we've been able to build digital public infrastructure where every citizen has a biometric or a digital identity. Every individual has a bank account, and every individual has a mobile which is linked to his bank account and his identity, and therefore he is able to do his debit and credit from his mobile bank. He need not go to the bank or use his debit credit card. He uses his mobile phone. But it has also enabled us to do direct benefit transfer and put money into his bank account. And during the COVID period, we put money into the bank accounts of almost 500 million people. When we started these bank accounts, only 17% of the women in India had bank accounts. Today, almost 80% of the women have bank accounts, and all very active bank accounts with a lot of saving, and therefore it has led to a huge amount of financial inclusion and transforming the lives of women in India. We've also been able to create digital public infrastructures like CoWIN app during the COVID. And these are all open source, open APIs and interoperable, on which private sector builds up on the railway tracks. So we build the tracks on which private sector competes and innovates. And therefore, India is the only country where PhonePe competes with Google Pay and WhatsApp competes with Paytm, and there are 40 apps competing, and therefore we do 11x more payments than what Europe and USA does, and 4x of what China does. But we've created many other digital public infrastructure like Diksha and Swayam in education, and we did the DigiLocker, which enabled us to do huge amount of the cost of our ability to create new bank accounts or provide new mobile phones has been the cost of customer acquisition has been very low as compared to $200 in the United States. In India, it's just $1.50. And therefore, because of low cost of acquisition, we've been able to do innovation to population scale at very low cost. The challenge before the world, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are 4 billion people without a digital identity. There are 2.5 billion people without a bank account. And there are almost 133 countries without a digital payment mechanism. And therefore, because they do not have a digital identity, you can't put money into their bank account, because they don't have bank accounts either, and because they don't have digital identity, you are not able to digitally leapfrog. So if you want to transform the lives of people across the world, the fastest route to our mind is digital transformation. And digital transformation is the fastest way you can ensure, as we've done in India, where we take 600 schemes of the government and put money straight into the bank accounts. When I was a young officer, I was working with the traditional fishermen of Kerala, and my job was to transform the lives of traditional fishermen. We were able to give them outboard motors. They went much further into the sea. We gave them fiberglass crafts. We gave them outboard motors. But they were prone to drinking. Fishermen live a very difficult life. They get a catch one day, they don't get a catch for the next 3 days, and they're prone to drinking. And therefore, families starve, and our job was to open their bank account so that we could put 50% of their daily catch into the bank account. Chasing physical bank managers then was a nightmare. It used to take us 8 to 9 months to open their bank accounts, because we were chasing physical accounts and physical paper, know your customers. Today in India, we open a bank account in less than a minute. So I've seen this journey of transformation from 9 months to less than a minute in India. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, my belief is that digital transformation holds the key to the next big social development and economic revolution in the world, because data identity will then give you the power to do artificial intelligence, machine learning, and pole vault in the world. And the last point I want to put is that India's presidency focuses very strongly on women. Because in India today, there are 1,075 women to 1,000 men, the latest NFHS survey. And our belief is that it will not be possible for the world to grow rapidly without putting women into positions of leadership. We've seen where we are able to give better learning, better education, better health standards, better financial inclusion, better nutritional standards, and where we are able to break out from the virtuous cycle of malnutrition for the women, the mother, and who then able to take care of healthy children, the country grows, the state grows, the district grows. And therefore, data in India has demonstrated our ability where in a large country like India, where we do competitive federalism, we rank states on performance, we name and shame them, we put their ranking in public domain. And what it has demonstrated is that where we are able to use good data for governance, you can transform lives. And therefore, we need good data for governance to improve the quality of lives for the women in the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, G20 is at a very challenging time simply because there are complexities and turbulence in the world. But India is determined to use this as an opportunity to take the world forward through a process of consensus. We believe that this is also an opportunity to bring the world together. This is also an opportunity for everybody to talk. Leaders must look beyond the immediate into the lives of citizens and transform their lives. And that is why our immense faith that eventually leaders will change the course of history from New Delhi. And our view is that we'll try to be optimistic, we'll try to be positive, and we'll try to be progressive. So, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to all your optimistic and positive suggestions, your ideas, your worldview on how India can make its G20 presidency, as our Prime Minister said, inclusive, decisive, action-oriented, and outcome-oriented. Please tell us. We are all here to listen to you, to your progressive ideas, and whatever you tell us, we will not only take it seriously, but try and take it forward to the leaders' communication. And we'll be very delighted that your progressive ideas will then help us to shape the vision, the world view, and the world vision of the leaders of the G20 countries. So we look forward to listening to your perspective. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
We are also particularly delighted. Thank you, sir, for that comprehensive and inspiring speech. We are also delighted that today we have with us not only Ambassador Chinoy, who is the chair of the T20 in India, but I can also see Paolo Magri, who chaired the T20 during the Italian term. Although he has not been announced as the chair yet, but we have a potential chair from Brazil as well. And we will have the Indonesian chair joining us later in the day. So we will have a series of T20 chairs, and we have the T7 chair as well from ADBI here. So they will all speak to us later today. We are trying to see how we can also coordinate and consolidate agendas emerging out of the G7 and the G20. I think that is also important. That's an artificial division, and we must try to see how the 7 can work with the 20 and the 20 with the rest of the 180. I think that has to be the task before us today. So to talk about the T20 and to deliver the closing remarks, let me now invite Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, who's been steering the Indian ship through this process. So Ambassador Chinoy, the mic is yours.
Good morning to all of you. Let me begin by firstly acknowledging the presence of Mr. Amitabh Kant, the Sherpa for G20 for India, Mr. Samir Saran, the President of the ORF, and all my friends that I recognize seated here this morning. Your presence here this morning is entirely appropriate and in keeping with India's philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The entire world is one family. So you're most welcome to India. You must have all seen how successful the Raisina dialogue was, and for that I congratulate Mr. Samir Saran. Many of you, in fact, expressed your views there on multiple issues, but today this G20 Global Think Tank Town Hall, I think, is our event, the G20 event. It's also an event with which I associate as the T20 chair. I must pose this question to you. Many of you might wonder what exactly is the DG of a think tank that is generally associated with defense, security, and IR doing with these esoteric subjects. But I must tell you that it is the vision of India's leadership to put everybody on the same page. We have many think tanks around the world, we have many think tanks in India, but far too often we do not work together. And I think this is a very, very appropriate moment for think tanks in India to actually come together, to work as a team and ensure that the G20 is a very successful event. You've just heard the Sherpa give you a very impassioned plea for making the G20 a great success. He is a fervent believer and a very fine representative of India's rise and India's success in recent years. And so I dare say that I have very little to add to that great presentation that he has given you, his vision of the G20 and India's rise. But suffice it to say that we, India, are hosting the G20 at a very, very unique moment. This G20 itself is a very unique event. It is for the first time in history, history of the G20, that you have 4 developing countries hosting the G20 back to back: Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And in my view, this will provide opportunity to build continuity and consensus. A continuity and consensus that also focuses on the Global South. And mind you, the Global South is to be respected much more than in the context of supporting views with regard to global wars and things like that. The Global South must be taken seriously with regard to its developmental needs, its financial needs. So I think this is also a very important moment for us to shift the focus of the G20 away from geopolitics to geoeconomics and to meeting the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, and particularly to ensure that the low-income countries and the developing countries are able to achieve that particular objective. Ladies and gentlemen, the world today is at a very, very difficult and complex juncture. There are several points of inflection which could lead into multiple unpredictable directions. Virtually every vector of the process of globalization is under challenge. We have seen how trade, technology, capital, social mobility of human resources, all this has been under a great deal of challenge, and matters have been compounded by the ravages of the pandemic, and more particularly the devastation that has been wrought on global supply chains by the war in Ukraine. And we can see that in our part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific as well, and this is true for other geographies, that it's not just trade that is under challenge. I'd like to repeat what I've said earlier. The 6 T's of globalization or factors in globalization are all under challenge. Trade in particular has been through a very precarious and difficult period, but it is not something that can be capped. It is something that is generally led by the private sector, by industrialists, by entrepreneurs, and therefore decoupling is essentially a chimera. We've seen how at the most difficult of moments, despite geopolitical tensions and efforts to restrict trade, trade between the most unlike of geopolitical partners has actually grown. For example, between India and China, for example, between Japan and China, for example, between the United States and China. The second T is that of technology. And technology here, we can say, has been greatly weaponized in recent years. But in India, we look at technology very differently. In India, we look at technology as a great enabler, as a tool to, in fact, give better lives to our people. And we have ensured that technology, particularly in the digital sector, in terms of digital public infrastructure, we have created and curated an architecture that is public, that is open, that's transparent, and that is essentially an enabler. And we therefore do not want to weaponize technology, but technology is being weaponized around the world. We also see that the third T of territorial differences is in fact sort of hanging like a Damocles' sword over the rest of the world. There are territorial differences in our geography. There are territorial differences and wars underway in Europe. But the key point that India would like to bring to the table is that differences should not be allowed to become disputes. And if there are disputes, that these should be resolved through peaceful dialogue and negotiations. And India therefore stands for peace and dialogue. And the earlier we bring wars to an end, the better it is. India is a country that's lived with occupation of its territory for the past 70 years. And yet we have tried our best to pursue the path of peace. This great legacy that India has since the times of Gautam Buddha and further propagated by the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, that of peace and non-violence, that of resolving issues through dialogue. And I think there is an opportunity here for the G20, if it is to focus on geopolitics as it has done over the past few days, to also take a hard look at this potential for peace. And it will be entirely appropriate if this kind of a consensus is struck on Indian soil. It will be a great tribute to our civilizational ethos. There is also the T of terrorism, which continues to threaten the peace and stability of societies, and without there being peace and stability, there can be no growth or development. We have the fifth T of tenets and narratives, the competing versions, the competing choices that are being given to people increasingly in binary terms, systems of global governance, social, political, economic development, in fact competing for attention. But it is time that we gave the people of the world, particularly the developing countries, choices beyond binary choices. And I think we need to therefore craft our responses accordingly. Countries like India can, as a resilient economy that has emerged strong and capable through the pandemic, work with like-minded partners and organizations around the world to provide that third choice beyond the binary choices. And the last T is that of trust, or the utter lack of it, the great mistrust that prevails today along multiple sectors, and we must work together to build greater trust. I do feel that in this grand exercise of the G20 is entirely capable of reinventing itself. It has done so in the past. On multiple occasions, it has risen to the challenge of the times, and I think it will also rise to the current challenges. In this, the Think 20, as the Ideas Bank, will do its best to bring you all together, to put your ideas together, and to prepare for a morrow that is bright and better for all. I am firmly convinced that one of the fundamental priorities of this G20, and I think this has also been hinted at by the Finance Minister of India, no less, should be to focus on developmental finance, particularly for climate action and adaptation. And the reform, in my view, of financial institutions, the treaty organizations, the Bretton Woods institutions is in many ways much more important and far easier to achieve than would be the reforms of the UN and the Security Council. For instance, I am appalled by the fact that while the IMF has done its best to provide extra special voting rights, increasing them from 250 to 750, while it did grant a one-time relief of SDRs of $650 billion US, I am to understand that not much progress has been made with regard to the surcharge of $4 billion. And today, as you are all aware, climate action will require nearly $4 trillion annually to be effective. And where is this money going to come from? So as the Sherpa said, it must come through blended finance. Countries around the world must learn to loosen their purse strings. For if the developed countries do not do that, it will be very difficult to achieve climate action goals. If the developing countries cannot meet that target, we will all suffer. So this is just one of the points that I wanted to emphasize. But let me end by simply saying that the task forces are represented by people among you. They're working very well. We hope to put together our ideas and start working on our communique and suggestions by May and June. And hopefully we will all work together to make it a grand success. Thank you all very much.